I'm speaking today to Jillian Buriak, Professor of Chemistry at the University of Alberta and the Canada Research Chair of Nanomaterials for Energy. For the last 6 years, Jillian served as the Editor-in-Chief of Chemistry of Materials, published by the American Chemical Society, which in my opinion, and that of many others, is the premier journal for material science research in the world. She recently stepped down from that position to go back to an associate editor position at ACS Nano. I'm speaking today with her about her scientific interests, scientific editing, peer review, fads, and the role of scientific publishing in creating an inclusive climate in the research community. Jillian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Darren. It's a real honor.
So let's start with a little bit of your personal background. Where did you grow up and how did you become interested in chemistry?
So I grew up in a suburb of Toronto called Mississauga. And at age 18, I was challenged by a student counselor who said, if you think you're so smart, why don't you go and apply to a couple of those fancy American schools? So she gave me an application for Stanford and Harvard. In those days, you actually wrote them by hand. And so I had this amazing choice. And so I decided to go to Harvard, where I was a rower. And then I took a year off teaching high school sciences in the Fiji Islands and working in Japan for a while. And then did my PhD in France. And then ended up in just down the street from you in the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla, California, and then started being a real academic at Purdue University. But I was never really interested in chemistry per se. I guess I was really into astronomy like crazy. So in the sky, there is a series of 110 Messier objects named after a French astronomer who in the 1700s, with a simple 2-inch refractor telescope, was looking for comets. He was always looking for comets, kept stumbling across these same things. And so these fuzzy things, and it's like, oh, that's not a comet. And so this is kind of this amateur astronomer big deal, is you see all of the 110 Messier objects. And so I was really nerdy and belonged to the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, and something I'm really grateful to my dad for having taken me to these, for him, extremely boring meetings. But for me, I was 14 years old, saying, this is great.
What did your parents
do? But I
do?
guess what the key thing was, as an undergrad, I was actually a math major for 2 years. And after a year and a half, I was looking around kind of going, okay, because they were saying, here, you have a choice. You have a choice in math between doing kind of a math/philosophy degree, or you can go and do something very applied. You could become an actuarial person at an insurance company. You're like, I mean, that's important, but that's not the most inspiring set of combinations. And so since I was doing chemistry anyway for pre-med, I was looking around, who could I go and maybe do undergraduate research with? And there was this kind of energetic and rather unique assistant professor just down the hall from George Whiteside's. And so he said, you just get in the lab and here's your project and start going. And so I just sort of followed that and became a chemist. So a little bit wasn't really planned.
I didn't realize that we had these two things in common. One, I grew up in the Rochester, New York area in a town called Hilton, very close to Lake Ontario, and you grew up in the Toronto area. So we both have Lake Ontario in our blood.
Exactly. You were actually, as the crow flies, probably only 30 miles away.
That's probably right. And the other is we both have an association with George Whiteside. So you were a teaching fellow or teaching assistant, as it is outside of the Boston area. And so how was that experience, just as an aside?
So that was really great. So in the beginning of junior year, there was, for some reason, a deficiency of teaching fellows or teaching assistants for George's organic chemistry class. It was either chemistry 17 or chemistry 27. So it's organic chemistry with a bioorganic flavor. And so as there weren't that many chemistry majors at Harvard, I think in my graduating class, there were only 16. So they asked us, and a few of us said, okay, massive imposter syndrome. I'd only been an undergraduate for 2 years, and start to anyway. So luckily, I'm so glad to this day that I got this. And so before the class was actually officially launched, this famous guy called George Whitesides called all the TAs to this meeting at the greenhouse cafeteria, which is in the science center on campus. And so there I was, I didn't know anybody. And this man sits down and he goes and he kind of puts his hands like this and he says, going around the table, I want to hear about everybody's innovation in teaching. I want to hear what sort of innovative techniques you're going to bring to teaching. And I guess everybody knew what was going to happen, because as they were seated around him, the only seat available, because I had just come from a class, was right next to him. Okay, because everyone else knew to avoid that seat. I didn't. I sat down. And then he looked at me and he said, "What's your name?" And I said it. And he said, "So what teaching innovations are you going to bring them?" I'm like, oh. I said something about enthusiasm and energy. I'm thinking I'm going to be learning. I'm going to be 2 hours ahead of the class in terms of topics, probably at any given moment, and let alone teaching innovations. And I know that he wasn't exactly thrilled. That wasn't the best response, because other people had kind of think, well, I'm going to do this approach. And so, yeah, luckily he forgave me. And he actually wrote me at the end of it a lovely, lovely letter. A personal letter saying, by hand, saying, "Dear Jillian, thank you so much for you. You got really great teaching evaluations." He wrote me a lovely, lovely letter. So
that's great. Tell me a little bit about undergraduate research and the topic that you studied, and how that influenced your trajectory.
So with Andy Barron, so he's now at Rice University, but he had at least 5 different very distinct projects in the lab. And I remember one of them was, so this is the late 80s, aluminum in Alzheimer's disease. It was also the era of low temperature superconductors, the YBCO series. Everyone was talking about it. It was even the era of cold fusion. So he was working a lot of organometallic, just basic fundamental organometallic chemistry. He said, "So what do you want to work on?" One day in the lab. He's like, "Oh, I don't." So I think he understood that probably I didn't have a strong opinion, and really probably had no idea what I was doing. Mm-hmm. And so he said, "Why don't you work on this project?" And so it was related to the high temperature superconductor work. And the idea was to use chemical vapor deposition to make these films of yttrium, barium, copper, and oxygen. And so if you're going to use chemical vapor deposition, you need volatile chemicals. So you're going to be heating them up, or however, volatilizing them. So you get this stream of these happy little complexes which are moving through this tube, and then at some point you zap them, heat or light or whatever it is that causes them to decompose, and then the elements fall onto the substrate, and that then could become your superconductor. So copper and yttrium, there were volatile precursors, but the tough one was barium, because it has a coordination sphere of like 50,000 really, but 10 or 12. Okay, so in the solid state, it just binds to everything, and it's just not particularly volatile. So he said, "Why don't you just go and try that?" So this was in the days before the internet. Okay. So what do? You don't know anything, and I'm the only person working on the project, but it's a really supportive group of people, because it was just a young and dynamic lab. And so you walk into the library, and you go and get your chemical abstracts book. This is, before CAS was all online. You pull out these heavy things. At the end of the day, you're just physically exhausted from carrying all these heavy books. And then you start looking, and you see, well, that's maybe if we used additives to the vapor phase, it would help make these things more volatile. And with help from my lab mates who knew a lot more inorganic chemistry than I did, this thing worked. And so we patented it and it got publications. It was actually used for a while by a few of the companies that were trying to commercialize these YBCO superconductors. So it was just a lucky hit. Like a lot of undergraduate research projects, it's so much luck of the draw, where you just kind of get a project that just hits and you have the right support around you. And so it was a super project. I never worked on superconductivity again. But like anything you work on, when it's particularly when you're an undergrad or you're a grad student, you say, why am I doing this? I'll never use this. It's so funny how these things come back and you say, wow, I'm so glad I had done that because I could apply it to this.
Hmm.
So I never thought I would be a materials scientist or chemist ever. But when we started to work on that later, all those things came back and it was like, wow, I was so glad that I had actually done this.
And so many times we see undergraduates who apply to graduate programs and maybe they only did one kind of work as an undergraduate. Of course, most of them only did one kind of work, and that's what they're good at doing. And then they apply to graduate school and they don't necessarily appreciate that they can branch out and do whatever they want. That's their time to reset. Actually, the same thing in going from grad school to postdoc. But in any case, no matter what happens, you always have that first language to draw from, and it's amazing.
Language. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic segue. We're going to fast forward several years, and I would like to ask you about your interest in scientific editorship and how you got into the publishing world.
So it was getting into the publishing world was never intentional. So I was on the board of reviewing editors for science for 5 years from 2004 to the very end of 2008. And that was totally unexpected. So I was, where was it? I could see a big kind of indoor farmers market. I don't remember if it was the Pike Market in Seattle, but there I was with Mark Levine. And Mark Levine is one of the associate editors with Science. He's based in Toronto. And I stumbled in across, I think it was somewhere at some conference trying to find lunch. And we were chatting and he said, would you be interested in being on the board of reviewing editors for Science? And I said, okay, well, what does that person do? So when in the old days, when you used to get the paper copies of Science, you'd flip it open, and of course you pass a few ads, and then you get to the masthead, and in font size maybe 2.6, there's a bunch of names. George Whitesides is one of them. So there's a bunch of names that you would never be able to read because you'd need a magnifying glass. But that's your board of reviewing editors. And so what I found out that they did and do is when the editors receive a publication is that a manuscript that's been submitted is that they share it with some number of the board of reviewing editors people, and you have to turn this around in 48 hours. You have a pull down menu, at least you did at the time, with your way you answer a couple questions and put in your comments, and that they would use that as input to decide whether or not to send this out for review. And so I was getting about 7 to 10 per week. I mean, the payback for this is massive. You got a free subscription to Science, which is only like $9. But this was a really fun thing to do because you were seeing 7 to 10 papers a week that represented what people thought was truly their best work or something that was really interesting or innovative. And it was great. And it also had a downside. And so I just want to say to Mark Levine and Phil Zarumi, I so appreciate what I learned. I mean, I absolutely loved that opportunity. But at the same time, it was during an era when electron microscopes were suddenly pretty inexpensive. And so there was a proliferation of these microscopes around the world. And so people were looking at their nanomaterials under these microscopes and say, oh, wow, look at that cool thing. I better put that in Science. And so this is kind of a really broad stroke overview and kind of negative comment to make because of course I was lucky enough to see some amazing work, and some of those papers that I handled, I saw, go on to being published. But there was a lot of half-baked stuff. Mm-hmm. And so it was also somewhat demoralizing too, because in essence, it was when you see something that's half baked, you can sense the palpable excitement of the people saying, "We got to get this out," but at the same time, like, well, what is that, and why is that important? And yeah, that looks pretty. And it was also the era of nano, and then take a noun, and put it. So nano is nano pickles, nano onions, nano coffee beans. It was just everything. So it was an interesting time, but I'd actually kind of had enough of that. And it was the turnaround time, 7 to 10 hours or 7 to 10 per week I was actually kind of burned out. And so I don't know if you want me to keep going.
Well, that's it reminds me of when there's a technological development or a step change in the price of instrumentation, you often get these fads in publishing, and you could see, I'm not a structural biologist, but you get the impression that 10-15 years ago publishing a structure was an automatic Cell or Nature or Science paper. Back when I think total synthesis was a bigger deal than it is now, that was an automatic JAX paper if you had a certain number of stereocenters, and it strikes me that the step change in EM costs did the same thing for nano. In fact, this probably sounds like the mid 2000s, like maybe 03 to 07 ish, when you got nano noun, and my colleagues in grads, my lab mates used to call it, it's become a new journal of silly nanomaterials, and I'm glad that some more rigor has been imposed in that area. How did you move from this position within the science tent to the ACS portfolio?
Again, that was unexpected. So I thought, okay, I need a break from this, from the editing thing. I thought this is just, I'm pretty burnt out. And so while I loved those 5 years, that's 5 years, I think I'm kind of done with it. And so I said that. And then about a week later, this was in late December, and it was really cold. And I'm a runner, and it was probably minus 40 that day. Because I remember, I know it had to have been really cold, because I was running with my BlackBerry. Remember what a BlackBerry was? And those things, you think iPhones are sensitive to cold? That one was really sensitive, even though it was made in Canada. So I was out running, and I had Paul Weiss's number, and Paul Weiss called me. And so he said, "Hey, Jillian," he's calling from, California. He said, "Hey, would you like to become an associate editor at ACS Nano? Let's talk." And then all of a sudden the battery died. It went clunk because it was freezing. My hands were like claws anyway, so it's freezing. So I ran home, like, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I ran home, and I'm waiting for the phone to warm up, so I can call him back. So he's what he described at the time was so different than what I had known before, at least my preconceived notions about what publishing was. And since I had never really been involved in how things worked at Science, I really didn't have a good idea of what that actually meant, how you interact with authors, how you choose reviewers. I didn't know any of that. But Paul talked about a very personal approach, and which is really kind of his hallmark. You do with authors on a very personal level. We treat them the way that we would like our own papers to be treated. Really tailor all of our letters to them, and to actually address them as people. No form letters, basically. And this sort of thing. And it was in the very early days. ACS Nano didn't have an impact factor. It was actually kind of seen as, what is that compared to nano letters? They didn't really have a sense of what the journal was at that point.
And also one of the first to take the ACS, under the ACS brand in the name of the journal.
Exactly. So I when my phone had finally warmed up and I'd heard what Paul was saying, I said to my husband, "Oh, I'm kind of interested in becoming an editor at ACS Nano." He said, "But you just said last week that you would never do an editing thing again. You said you were burned out. You said you were tired of it. You were done with it. You'd done all of that." And I said, "But Paul Weiss, said that." He said, "Are you crazy?" And, we know the answer to that is, yeah, crazy. So I started with that, and I started with a small number of papers, which was what I was assigned. But this was just really fun. And it was really great to deal with people on the personal level. It was that made the difference, with was interacting with people, saying, hey, I really like your paper, why can't you do this, or can we do that, or and dealing with the reviewers, and just the whole thing made it so personable and interesting in that regard. And so I went from, I think, 50 papers a year to over 500, handling kind of thing. And it was just great.
Wow. How about on the other side, and when you have a negative interaction with an author, do you lose sleep over that? That would be a big barrier for me, I think, if I were to go into editing.
I know what you mean. And so I'll just put this out there right away, is that the number of negative interactions is actually much smaller than you think. And I also thought that, boy, there's gonna be a lot of mad people, and you certainly see nowadays on social media, on Twitter, people complaining about reviewer number 2 or reviewer number 3, whichever one it is, or both. But I think the most important thing when you're dealing with someone who's very angry is to be as transparent as you can be, and say, here's what's going on. And so many people, that diffuses so many things. I mean, I got, so what, one very well-known person, we actually declined their paper, and the response, I got this personal letter back, handwritten, saying that was the nicest rejection I ever got. It's so being able to explain it, and say, that, yeah, these reviewers may be, as you say, wrong, but the fact that they misinterpreted your paper may be because your paper wasn't clear here. And so you're trying to explain why.
Mm-hmm.
That helps so much. And yeah, I know that still some people go away kind of pissed off, but at least if we've tried, I think that the vast majority remember that, and we actually get a lot of positive feedback from that.
And then you wanted to go deeper into editing, and that led you to editor-in-chief of Chemistry of Materials. How did that happen?
So again, you don't apply for these things. I remember I was sitting on a plane, and they were just before they shut the door. Remember planes? When we used to sit on planes? Do you remember those? Yeah, yeah.
I do. I have mixed feelings about it.
Me too. Actually, me too. Online Zoom lectures, it's pretty cool. You can be in Singapore and Korea, New York City, kind of on the same day. I was sitting there, and the student, kind of wasting my time, and an email came through and said, would you like to be considered for the editor-in-chief of Chemistry Materials? If you do, please give me a ring. I'm like, oh, okay. So anyway, they had to shut the door. So I was sitting there thinking the whole time, what would that mean? And then when I spoke to the person who was head of the search committee, they said, okay, what you need to do is put together a vision statement. And to be honest with you, at the time, I didn't really have any vision. Chemistry Materials, I had published there a few times, but it wasn't, in terms of when ACS launched their ACS series of journals, like ACS AMI, and which is now branched into 5, 6 separate journals now. ACS AMI and ACS Nano were much more exciting, I think, in my opinion, at the time. And so I was thinking, what could I do that could bring this journal, Chemistry Materials, to something that could make it resonate with younger people, early career researchers, make it sort of exciting. So I said, well, if I can write this vision statement, then okay, I would consider it. But if I can't think of anything, then. And so kind of like a lot of things, if you understand what the problems are, then you can actually come up with solutions. And so the first thing is you flip through the journal and say, okay, what are the problems? Why isn't it resonating with young people? Why are early career people not publishing there? Why are they sending their stuff to ACS Nano and other places? Plenty of competitors out there, Advanced Materials, etc. So you kind of look at it, you say, all right, and then it's like, okay, and then you start writing this thing, and then suddenly I had 5 pages just with ideas, and they go, okay, well, I'll just send that in. This is, kind of the best, what I can see answers some of the problems. Again, you can't bounce this off anybody. So Yeah, and then they said, yeah, it's yours. So,
What were some of your initiatives in your vision statement, and how many of them were implemented?
so one was okay. So if we're going to try to have some resonance with early career people, so we started the Up and Coming series. Now I know someone who wrote the very first perspective as an up and coming young rising star, and that his name was. Let me check my notes. Darren Lapomi. Oh, that was you. So you wrote the very first one that was published. So the idea was is to capture early career scientists. We had said this is open to government researchers, industry people, academics, and in terms of academics, generally professors just before tenure time, and so they could include in their tenure package. Oh, I was invited to write this perspective about my work by the editor in chief of this ACS journal. Isn't that great? Tenure me.
And it did carry a lot of weight, for the record.
Well, your record spoke for itself, and still does. And so that turned out to be really popular because we're giving these early career scientists the platform to say, why did you choose this area? You've staked your career on this choice of topic. Why did you choose that? Because obviously you put a lot of thought into that. Tell us why. We're interested to know. And how did it work? And how did it what happened? And so people seem to really like that. And so that for me was a big success. Another one was social media. And I know some people are saying, oh, God, social media, what a waste of time. I think that has been so important. And to really have a two-way streak, and to simply not use Twitter to say, okay, here's another title of a paper, here's another title of paper, but to actually interact. So we'd get a lot of ideas back from people saying, why don't you do this? And hey, have you noticed this? Or it would also keep us up on what the latest papers in other areas that people were working on, so we could say, hey, could you do a follow-up paper, with us if you're doing one that has more of a chemistry of materials type flavor. And so really helped us get to know the community. And I think that's the most important, because we're serving the community, so you have to know it.
How do you feel about the perception that chemistry of materials went from a more fundamental solid state chemistry, perhaps more inorganic focus, to including a lot more soft matter polymers, but in particular more applied research? Is that a fair characterization?
I think so, because initially it was very much a home for the solid state community, and it still is. I mean, the solid state community, of course, is absolutely critical and essential. I mean, you think about from everything from thermoelectrics to battery materials, solid state, semiconductors. So of course that's really important. And I don't know if it was actually a correct perception, but it certainly was the perception. Because when you have editors like who are still with chemistry materials, like Elsa Reckminus, who's big in the area of organic electronics, one of the founders of organic electronics and Bell Labs, and Frank Caruso in Melbourne, who's very big in soft materials. So you have editors there who are handling these papers. So they are getting submissions, but it's a small fraction of the whole pool of manuscripts. And it just wasn't seen as the place for people like you to submit. And so a lot of it is simply pushing on and advertising and promoting this idea that, hey, we have this expertise. We really want editorial expertise. We really want papers in this area. We welcome them, and simply making a fuss about that, showing people that not only can we handle it, but we want these papers, and that when we have these papers in these areas, we're going to go and promote them. We're going to have special issues. We're going to have virtual issues. We're going to have promote them with social media, and that we are going to get the word out on your behalf. And I think that's the critical thing.
Yeah, and just as a plug for CM, it became my mode journal throughout my independent career. I have more papers in chemistry of materials than any other journal.
Wow, it's so good.
And it started with the up and coming perspective. What is your opinion of impact factor, and to what extent did it drive editorial decisions?
So in terms of, I'm going to say this right off the bat, in terms of editorial decisions, paper is in front of you, is the impact factor is simply not part of that.
How about strategic, I guess, strategic decisions at the journal?
Love it or hate it, it's there. Okay, so the impact factor, what is this really? Is the impact factor a proxy for quality? We all know it's not. I mean, you can see in high impact factor journals, up to a third of them end up with zero citations. I mean, Prashant Kamat at Notre Dame and the editor-in-chief of ACS Energy Letters, just look at his Twitter account. He's always crunching numbers and bashing through Web of Science to make a point that if you have impact factor X, some number of papers simply contribute nothing to that impact factor or very little. And some papers contribute huge amounts. It's such a huge distribution. And so it's not a proxy for quality. That said, we know that university administrators and institutional administrators, granting agencies, if they can't read, they can sure count, right? And so taking all of science and crunching it into a single number and then saying this number is higher than this number is so easy and so tempting. So we understand that. So I think that you in terms of decisions with respect to special issues, virtual issues, if you're going to promote an area, there you may say, and I think it's fair to say that we do, that okay, if impact factor is important, then let's go and promote this group of papers in the area of, say, perovskites, lead halide perovskite solar cells, because that that's going to generate a lot of attention at this point. Or let's do it on HER, OER, oxygen evolution reduction, reducing catalysts, things like this. But in terms of the day-to-day editorial decisions, absolutely zero impact. I mean, there's so many examples of sleeping beauties, papers that simply don't get recognized for some time, and then they turn out to be so important. And we want to capture those papers. That's what science is about. We are there to serve the community. We're not there to generate a high impact factor so that we can make more money. We're not for profit. So it's a very conflicted set of opinions.
Sure. Is there a better metric or a better way to convey to promotion and tenure committees that this is a quality journal in this particular researcher's field?
At least what we can do is to think about other types of other metrics if necessary. So one very different metric is, of course, the Google Scholar metric, which is an H5 base. So it's looking at basically it's the equivalent of your H index, but over 5 years for your publications. Having that again, that gives you 2. But I think that quality again is something. This is where for tenure and promotion, where those letters are so important. I mean, having someone write a thoughtful letter. When I write tenure and promotion letters, I usually spend 4 to 6 hours because this is someone's career. You're not gonna, I can't just say, I just spend 15 minutes. It's like, no, 4 to 6 hours. So go into a few of the papers, and and the best letters that I see that I aspire to write myself, or I'll go into a paper and say, gosh, this was really creative. This was really interesting that the person took this with this and ended up doing this. This was really hard. I wrote one recently where I said, there's no way you could have paid me to have tried this. Okay, when I was an assistant professor, there is no way you would have, because not only was this fire and fury, I literally worried about this stuff blowing up in the lab, but I would have worried about just getting a mess. And this person did not get a mess. In fact, it just beautiful work. And so that was my job, is to say, this was so important because of this, and they made it look so easy, but trust me, it's not. That's why I never would have touched that with a 10-foot pole. And so that's kind of my job now as a senior scientist, is to really make that point. And yeah, they published a lot of this work in JACS and Chemistry Materials, for instance, but they didn't put it in Nature, blah, 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 or some other journal like that. but that doesn't mean that it's not quality. In fact, exactly the opposite.
Mhm.
So I think those letters are so important.
And the promotion and tenure file in its many components is a lot like a graduate application. You can go onto Twitter and find a reason why we should discount every single part of the graduate application, yet somehow we have to make this super hard decision based on 5 or 6 pieces of information about a person we've never met and never seen work in the lab. At the very least, before I leave impact factor, I would just like to say to ACS that it should not be reporting them to 5 significant figures, just because it goes against everything we've learned about
So
data
the reason
reporting.
why they do that, by the way, is you notice that when they say impact factor, they actually have a little trademark or copyright or something. So you need you as the person who is actually reporting that, you're those are the data from Clarivate Analytics, Clarivate, and so Clarivate, which used to be Thomson Reuters, and so you need to pay them in order to report those data, and you have to report those data the way they report it. So yeah, I know.
This is why we have these conversations. I had no idea. That's very interesting.
And if you want even more opinions, their database is different than the one that we see when Web of Science. And so every year it's the same thing. The impact factors that they publish from their private database is not what we see, the one based on the database in the public domain. And we never understand why they're different. And in some cases, they're very different. And for some journals and for others, they're bang on the money. So it's a completely non-transparent thing, and you better have all those 5 digits. But I agree with you 100%.
I think that one of the most memorable aspects of your editorship of Chemistry of Materials were the editorials on various aspects of writing style, figure design, articles on inclusion in science, and I wonder if you always had this drive in you to speak directly to the scientific community, because very few editors, I think, were quite so active in that role.
So I go back to the 5 years at ACS Nano. With Paul Weiss, he said, I didn't know that either. I mean, I think, journals are for publishing science. But this was Paul's thing from the beginning, is that, and there was a New York Times article, and this Scholarly Kitchen the Scholarly Kitchen blog has this piece on journals. What is the role of a journal? I mean, why do we even care about journals? We could just stick everything up on a preprint server, and that and by the way, I'm a huge supporter of ChemArchive. But why don't we just do that? But journals really serve as the core of a community. Like how do you define a community? So in the early days, I defined it nanoscience. Is this paper really nano? I said, well, would you have published it in Nano Letters or ACS Nano, for instance? So that's how we would have defined it, as this community thing. And so what is a community? A community normally would have its town square and have your Herald and have a newspaper. And so sharing or encouraging discussion, I think, is really important. That's what Paul Weiss did. And so Paul always gave us the opportunity, and today, and still does today. In the latest issue of ACS Nano, I have an editorial he encouraged me to write on the importance of preprint servers. I can't believe I'm writing that. Like, if you asked me 3 years ago, I'd be like, what do you need that for? Now I'm like, I love this thing. So anyway, I'm sidetracked.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to that, because I think a lot of us are interested in hearing from people that have spent time in publishing, why isn't ChemArchive undermining the current model, and why is it supporting the current model?
So it isn't, and it is such a surprise. But having the voice to be able to make these opinions, again, that was Paul. He was always encouraged us to do that. And so then when I jumped to chemistry materials, took that idea, like, well, a lot of these ideas or questions were fed to me and to us from authors saying, gosh, how do I do this? And how do I did it? And why is it that, and how do you pick covers? And why do you always tell me to change the font of my figures from Times to Arial? You're always telling us that. Why do you tell us that? I'm like, well, because Arial is designed for graphics and Times Roman blah 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 is designed for text, and it just doesn't look good in a figure if you're going to use Times Roman. Anyway, still stuff like this. So I thought a lot of this was written on a Friday night, pretty brain dead, and just kind of writing it. And I didn't have any brain for flowery language. It's just like put it all down. Just get it out.
And I think if you were to publish them as a book, it would be a nice complement to the ACS style guide. So
Kamat too is a big author of these things, so you'd have to include Prashant too.
Can be a co-authored volume. So you have a history of publishing meta-analyses in your research. I remember a few years ago you published one on data reporting in organic solar cells, and there was a lot of great analysis. I think it came from possibly a place of pet peeve, perhaps, within you, and but I found that it was very insightful, changed my own thinking about the way we report data. I wonder if you think there should be how should standardization of data reporting, particularly in some of these fields that are more record driven, how should that work?
This is so important. We actually, a group of ACS journals in about 2016, put together a series of 22 pieces on standardizing reporting of batteries, thermoelectrics, organic electronics, things like this, reporting of nanomaterials. So that's there. So I think there were 8 ACS journals that were involved, and these were ACS journals that touch upon or are deeply embedded in the field of materials, broadly speaking. So that was for me, that was a really important thing to do, because we could then share these with authors. So when people would send us a paper and they were looking at the photocatalysis results and saying, you don't have any statistics and we can't tell if your experimental variability batch to batch is bigger than your reported differences between catalyst A, catalyst B, catalyst C. But the challenge is that these editorials, that they end up published in 2014, 2015, 2016, and then a few years later, they're hard to find. Where do they go? How do we keep these in a place where everyone can refer to them? Because these were written by people who were trying to be thoughtful and helpful, and maybe they're not perfect. They're not the end all and be all. They represent the standards of that time. So they're just a snapshot in time. And of course, standards can change as techniques get better and understandings improve. But there isn't a central place. And I think that's what's really lacking. There should be a central place where these things are kept. And so we could see and this should be pan journals, where we can see the standards that, for instance, that the Nature family of journals with respect to photovoltaics, they have their standards. If you're going to send us a paper on solar cell characterization and testing, you better include these things. I'd like to see that, and I think that we can all improve as a community. But right now, it's scattershot, and this has frustrated me for many years.
And I think that bolded number in the citation, namely the year, has a lot to do with whether or not a person is going to, or how seriously somebody's going to take it. So it could be a great paper, a great review from 2012, but there must be a more recent one. This is an argument I would attribute to my friend Mikhail Katz and others who posted on Twitter a couple of years ago about the idea of allowing second editions to reviews and third editions to review articles without having to redo the entire thing, and without it being regarded as sort of a cheap republishing of a review article. Because there might have been a definitive review of a topic in 2005, but a lot has changed. The author might have moved on to other topics, but that was still the definitive review, and why not have another edition like a textbook, and that it could even involve other authors. Someone else could take the reins, and that could be the definitive review of self-assembled monolayers or conjugated polymer transistors or something. Why did you step down from the editor-in-chief role?
We have our professional side, then we have this other thing which is called the rest of our life, and chemistry materials really was one of the greatest times of my life, but it was also I as a person, I think my family had sensed the workload's effect on me probably 3 years before. I mean, when I have my own teenage kids saying, "Gosh, you have no patience anymore. Your fuse is really short." And as teenagers, I knew that I just simply couldn't do it all. We have also my research group was also, they say, "We know that you're so busy, so we didn't tell you." I'm like, "Why didn't you tell me?" They said, "Because, and so something had to go. And it was very sad. I gave a year's warning. But I couldn't, something had to go. I just wasn't a very nice person anymore.
So,
I kind of want to keep my husband, and I want to keep my kids, and I want to keep my research group happy, and I also just want to, stay sane. And I couldn't do it anymore. And so when I was so lucky when Paul Weiss said, "Do you want to come back to ACS Nano?" I'm like, that is absolutely fabulous.
A lot of us would have said that you paid your dues and could have stepped away from editing for, at least a couple years, but we're glad to have you still.
I love it so much.
So the last topic I want to touch is on inclusion and equity in science, and particularly scientific publishing's role in promoting it. There are, concerns about concerns that sexist and racist attitudes affect retention, promotion, tenure of women and people of color, and getting published in reputable journals, and that affects their promotion and tenure files. And I wonder what you think the role of scientific publishing is in promoting a climate of inclusion and equality in the research community and more broadly.
So this is a question I've been asking myself a lot. And so following people like Dr. Rubidium, Rachel Burks on Twitter, and other people, maybe I realized that I actually probably, outside of my own experience, and I'll use the sociology term, my own lens, as a white woman, as an Anglophone white woman, okay? So in English, so there's a lot of privilege there, is that I really didn't know anything, nothing. And so part of my, and I've had people of color, many people of color in my group, but I still really realized that I could pretend that I had an idea of what they were experiencing, but I don't. So I decided, so this is my thing right now, my job, my homework for myself is to read. Right now I'm exclusively reading, luckily, I say luckily, I have some insomnia, which means I do read a lot at night. So I'm reading Black and Indigenous authors exclusively right now. So this is my homework. So reading Ijeoma Olowu, Robin DiAngelo, she's white, but she wrote White Fragility. I'm reading Ibrahim K. X. Kendi right now, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm just reading Maya Angelou fiction. I mean, just doing it. And I'm still working through it. I also, a book called Be in White Supremacy was definitely an eye-opener, because I realized, holy moly, we don't like to see ourselves as racist and sexist, but kind of as Ibrahim X. Kendi is saying, it's time that we stop using these words as pejoratives, that when we term something racist or someone as racist, that being a racist, the harm of being called a racist is a lot less than the harm imposed on someone if that harm is racist or sexist. And so I'm realizing I sort of have a lot of cringy moments when I remember things that I had said or had done, and I thought, oh my God, that was that was pretty racist what you just did or what you did. And so I am still very much working through that. But I think the most important thing that I'm realizing is that, holy moly, we are working in a white world. The world of academia arose from European cultures, and that things like microaggressions are absolutely real. I've also thinking back to times when I myself have I realize now what I said was clearly a microaggression. I mean, I didn't think of it that way, but that's what it was. Ways I've judged people in candidacies and defenses, and so I'm still working through it. And I think that maybe is the most important thing, is to do a lot of reading. It's time for us to listen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go on, Darren.
Do you think publishing has a role to play in the
Absolutely, as judge and jury, absolutely.
Should ACS be tracking racial, ethnic, and demographic characteristics of its authors? Currently, it's not.
Absolutely. And so this was something, so as a white person seeing the world, I thought, well, yeah, we're all neutral. We're reviewing, it's all race neutral. It's based on the science. I drank that Kool-Aid. And now reading the works of people of color, saying, how can you even tell if there's a problem unless you have the data? And so we have to have that data. And so I'm a big pusher, get the data, and then you can see if you have a problem. And frankly, I'm pretty sure that there is a problem. But until you just kind of like when I jumped into the chemistry materials and the vision statement, if you don't know what the problem is, you can't solve it. So this absolutely has to be tracked. It has to be tracked. It has to be. And it should be done on a voluntary basis, but I think that the vast majority of people would be interested in providing that information, because they know as long as you state why you're doing this and you're doing it transparently and openly, I think it's important.
Sure. And I think this is a time when all white Anglophone people are going through a massive reevaluation of how they conduct themselves professionally. To close, what scientific problems excite you the most in your lab, and more generally?
So in 2006, so I live in a petro state. So Alberta is a petro state, fossil fuel based economy. And in 2006, boy, the money was rolling in from oil sands, tar sands, whatever term you want to use. But I had this influx of students showing up at my door saying, I want to work on renewable energy. I want to do something that's really going to help the future. And I'm thinking, well, but you could be making all this money in the oil sands, being a petroleum engineer. But no, I really want to work on this. And so that's now become the single biggest area of research in our group. And I'm so glad that those students came to us and continue to come to us and say, and so for us, this is it. It's renewable energy, it's solar energy, it's battery, it's electrochemical energy storage. And luckily we were in the right place at the right time. We were interested in surface chemistry, nanoscale materials. And so, it's just a quick shift. We were just piling little bits of money in there, bootleg money, just to get these things started so that you could actually have some preliminary results to apply for grants. And that's now the single biggest thing. And I'm so glad we're there.
Is there anything that you wish I'd asked but didn't, or any final thoughts that you'd like to leave our audience?
So as the father of at least one child, I was a little bit surprised you didn't ask about children in academia, but that's...
Okay, well, I think we should ask. So my wife and I, we're both PhD postdocs. We both work either in science or science adjacent fields. As you mentioned, I have a year and a half year old, an 18 month old. You can see the sleep, the synapses. Yeah. And we talk about work-life balance versus work-life integration, and things neither the family nor the work life is ever really off for us. And I wonder how you feel about that.
Absolutely. Sometimes I encounter people who say, I'm the one thing I'm good at is compartmentalizing. I'm so good at compartmentalizing. I'll just tell you right now, the worst thing for me is compartmentalizing. I simply can't. It's just like I've got several, like you, probably so many academics, you got several levels of consciousness working at any given time, or maybe you are switching back and forth between them. I think that having kids was probably one of the best things I ever did to become actually a better scientist. I just think that, and managing a group, the skills are so complementary. I can't imagine a life without kids, though I shouldn't say that. I think I probably would have been absolutely happy without kids. I wouldn't have known. Having them now, I can't imagine what it would have been like without them. Do you see what I mean? I
there's
did
no
do the
bigger
control experiment.
Life transformation. I mean, I look at friends who most friends my age now have kids, but that period where you can do anything you want at any time, and actually there's a lot of satisfaction in constraint of this kind.
Perfect word.
And you're right. I like this idea of multiple levels of cognition. There was a time I was very interested in meditation. Because of the election, I've had to get back into it, which it caused me a lower back strain, which sort of distracted me from the election, which was great this past weekend. But anyway, that's time for something else.
Is it great when an injury is a good thing?
Yeah. Well, I'm
so glad I got that injury.
It's like muscle creams that contain methyl salicylate. It's a distraction. The icy hot and Bengay.
The smell of Bengay. Oh man, I know that too well.
Capsaicin ointment and things that it's like you sprain your ankle and you pinch yourself, so the pinch is more acute. Anyway, not that I've ever done.
That's what kids are for, and bang
your
head. Makes work seem so much easier.
I injured my thumb scraping the guts out of a pumpkin the other day with my kid.
Oh, God.
And then it was healing. And then a week later, I shut it in the drawer of her dresser, and then it swelled up again. So we're mostly back from the brink there. And another aspect of work-life integration, we talked about this before the camera started rolling, about the COVID-19 vaccine trial, and wanting to protect my family, but also using it as an opportunity to have a frame of reference for which to write human subject research, proposals involving IRB, and I enjoy doing things at once. I don't compartmentalize either. I mean, I had CNN in one ear the other day while working on something, and I'm sure all the productivity books would tell me that was completely the wrong thing to do. But I'm here. I have a family. Things have been pretty good for me professionally, so things are not that broken in the way that I conduct my life.
No judging.
Yeah. So thank you, Jillian, for bringing up the topic of family, and for doing this podcast episode. And I really appreciate it. And I will see you on Twitter and in conferences.
Holy moly!
When those eventually happen again.
Stay safe, everybody.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Darren.